Okay, so now these last two songs are I've I've ordered them as sort of as war pigs because it's the end. At this point, the war is the shooting war on the ground is pretty much over. The bombing war is not, and the bombing war is going to produce a genocide of the Cambodians. What is briefly called Kampuchea and then goes back to being called Cambodia. Um, so, but by this point, what you can see in War Pigs, which is Black Sabbath, and this is the beginning of Ozzy Osbourne, and it's amazing. As I say, it's sometimes amazing that any of these people survive, given the way they lived. Like the fact that Keith Richards is still alive, it's like, oh my god, we never thought when we looked at the way the Stones were behaving in the early 70s that they didn't look like they were going to survive another day. So Ozzy Osbourne is like, I can't believe the guy's still alive, let alone has had a TV show. Things just get more and more bizarre. Reality is more bizarre than you can possibly imagine it. But War Pigs is again one of these sort of obvious, by this time very obvious songs. But the real connection here is, again, it's apocalyptic, right? And it uses a fair amount of this sort of, the idea in the same way that Kiss will trade on this, and Marilyn Manson to an extent, is that there's this sort of attempt to outrage the middle class, which by this time is kind of hard to outrage because they're like, okay, that's it. We tapped out during Jumping Jack Flash or some, or I Don't Get No Satisfaction. The Rolling Stones, they're like, well, we don't do that. As Merle Haggard says, we don't smoke marijuana. So, okay. So by the time Black Sabbath came around and War Pigs, the connections between big business and the war, and the fact that basically this was there was going to be a judgment, that there was an evil, effectively, the bureaucracy had become an evil thing, was accepted by many anti-war protesters, and there was no the politeness and the veneer of sort of the quiet resistance of the early 60s was completely gone, and it was a looked like a full out revolution. And that's why it was so, people really thought the revolution was going to happen. They were like, comes the revolution, baby. It really looked as though it's very interesting to see, when you see a movement crest like that and then it subsides, and then what happens after is this sort of terrible vacuum or vacancy, and where it's almost impossible to get people galvanized to make political change because they've been exhausted basically by the effort. And there's a lot of similarity in that kind of raising of people's spirits and their energies and the sort of in the revolution, towards the revolution, and then having that flatten. There's a lot of similarity between that and, say, evangelical tent meetings and revival meetings. I remember my grandmother talking about what came to be called the burned over district, which we actually are right near, because in upper New York State and into southern Ontario, evangelists would run tent revival meetings. So they would come into southern Ontario and set up these big tents and have these massive sort of evangelical Christian ecstatic religious sort of meetings where people would speak in tongues and become hysterical and pass out and sort of have these religious experiences or hysterical experiences. When I say hysterical, I don't mean that they were running around screaming, although they might have, but that they were. It was like being high. I mean, it's this. That's why people went to these things, because it could literally be an out of body experience. So the thing about that is that the districts, they're called a burned over. This was called a burned over district for a reason, because you could make money as a tent revivalist, tent revival preacher, as they were called. But after a while, people wouldn't come to the meetings. They were burned out. I mean, basically, there was no more emotion left. People were done. They were like, I'm just going to stay on the farm and just live my life, and I don't have the energy to go to a revival meeting. And the same thing kind of happens here, where as the revolution begins to peak and the war begins to slow down, and Nixon, it looks like, is going to be put in jail, and all of that, sort of the air kind of is let out of this massive balloon that looks as though it's going to burst. As that happens, people are exhausted. And so in the late 70s and the early 80s, there was very little political will to fix things. And this is so as a result, I remember in the 80s especially, the trend, this was the bizarre thing to have people who had been hippies, say 10 years before, who are now all about making money. And the drug shifted, so if your friends were smoking weed in the early 70s, the mid 70s, by the early 80s, my friends some of them were smoking weed and some of them were doing cocaine, and it was like, okay, I'm out of here, because it was, cocaine was so entirely different. And the whole, it was all about late 70s. It's all about disco. I was like, Jesus, this is sort of like the worst kind of consumer capitalism you could possibly imagine, which had come right on the heels of this sort of peace, love. As the mother and Zitz says, peace, love, and Wi-Fi, baby. Because it's like, that's what it's like now. Peace, love, and Wi-Fi. So what had happened to the revolution? This is why, at the moment, it's so interesting, and I think one is anxious to hope that the movement towards justice for people of color in Canada and America, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movements, can bring about policy changes and actually change the laws before they lose the momentum, because ultimately time is against a revolution. It has to happen fast. And as one of my supervisors in American Studies used to say, the biggest problem with some of these, with a revolution, is if it's successful, because then you've got to do the work, and then now what are you going to do? And then you have to start actually figuring out who's going to be in charge, and let the fighting begin, right? So anyway, so War Pigs is one of these I think overt statements about the relationship between three things we've been talking about: the apocalyptic endings, big business, the war in Vietnam, and that it's all going to crash. Okay, then the next song is The Crash, where John Prine, who was extremely famous and just died, I think last year, maybe 2019, I think John Prine just died. And he was sort of considered to be one of the poets of the revolution. There are a number. Dylan is one, Phil Ochs was one, OCHS, Donovan was one, Simon and Garfunkel. Well, really, it was Paul Simon. Who were very thoughtful, philosophical writers, especially Dylan. I mean, that's why Dylan won the Nobel Prize for Literature, right? Because it was an astonishing contribution to the literature of a generations plural, really, because he just didn't ever stop. So this last song is John Prine's famous Sam Stone, and this is a tough song. I mean, it's a song about, the war is only there tangentially. Sam Stone came home to his wife and family, having served in a conflict overseas, and that's all you ever hear about Vietnam. So basically, this is the beginning of the legacy of what's going to happen when these Vietnam vets come home, and their heads are full of broken glass, and what are they going to do? And in this case, Stone is addicted to heroin. Now, this is something which happened in the late years of the war because partly the American Army, in all of its wisdom, decided that they couldn't have soldiers smoking weed. And so they collected all the marijuana they could find in Vietnam, and there was lots and lots of it because marijuana is like native to. This is a wonderful, tremendous growing. Marijuana likes lots of hot weather and moist, rich soil. It was fantastic for growing wheat. Well, the Army was like, well, we can't have the men drinking, fine, but smoking weed, no. So they collected all the weed and they burned it, and there were these massive weed fires. They piled up bales and bales of marijuana and they burned it all. And apparently, if you were downwind of this, you get this sort of these massive contact highs. Well, what happened then is it's not as though people are going to, if they can't get weed, what are they going to do? Well, where were they? Well, they're in South China, right? They were south of China. Well, guess what they could get? Well, very pure, very cheap heroin. And so what happened was the men got addicted to heroin. Now, it had to be readily available. It had to be very cheap, and it was pure because the stuff was basically uncut. It had come right from the opium field, the poppy fields. So the men came home to America with these terrible heroin habits, and in America, the heroin was very expensive and not available, and it produced this. So there was a surge in heroin-related crime, and that starts to show up in all the movies. Suddenly, every Vietnam vet, of course, had to be a heroin addict. In every movie you've ever seen at that point, it's like, oh, they're all hooked on heroin. It's like, no, but so Sam Stone is one of these basically after the war victims, and the song is to some extent connects with Roger Stone, no relation to Sam, who is a novelist. Yeah, I'm just thinking if I've got that right. Yeah, that's right. Robert Stone. Roger Stone is the crazy guy. Okay, sorry, I had his name in my head because of this Trump thing. Jeez. Anyway, Robert Stone, pardon me, who wrote very famously a book called "Who Will Stop the Rain." Well, it was called Dog Soldiers, I think originally. Yeah, Dog Soldiers. And it becomes the movie Who Will Stop the Rain with a very young Nick Nolte in it. And it's about a guy who comes home from the Vietnam War and by accident basically winds up with a brick of pure heroin. And it ruins everybody's life who comes in contact with this thing. It's just a poison. It's a poison pill, basically. And that's sort of the point. But Stone went on to write a number of other famous books. He was sort of one of the literary writers who came out of the war, as opposed to people who wrote sort of war memoirs and then kind of that was sort of did their thing and then disappeared. Anyway, so Who Will Stop the Rain is a good film. It's not bad. It's pretty good. It's pretty. It's sanitized, but it's not too sanitized. So Sam Stone basically then comes home and is a heroin addict, and that's it. He dies, right? He has an overdose finally, and the sense in the song is that that's a great relief for everybody, especially because the heroin is such an expensive habit, which it wouldn't have been in Vietnam, where nobody had much money anyway. The soldiers were being paid, but the pay was a pittance. It was, I can't remember what they made a month. It's like they made $100 a month or something like that. I can't remember, but the heroin was cheap and it was right there and it was pure, so you didn't need much, right? So there's this incredible, so that's one of the things that this song particularly picks up on. Okay, and that takes us to the end of Lecture 9's music. All right.